Hey there, and welcome to Crochet Therapy. I'm Barbara, your host for today's help session. This is our Tuesday help series, and today's series is going to be on gauging your work. And since we're live, I'm going to wait just a moment and see if we can get some people on before we actually get into the meat of what we're talking about today. So, welcome everybody. I've got my Diet Coke here, and I'm going to take a little sip. The sun is coming out, even though it was very, very foggy this morning, very foggy. And they said that tomorrow it's going to be even more foggy. So, yeah, let's see. Hey, Valerie, PJ, Robin. Hello, everybody. Hello. So it's good to see you. Good to see you. Let's see. I don't know how to get rid of my emoji. Let's see. Here we go. Type. There we go. Now I have more room. I did a little emoji and I don't normally use those, but I saw a little kitty in a box and I thought, well, I can't resist that. So I put it up there, but you know me. It takes me forever to figure out how to undo what I just did. So welcome to everyone. Today's Tuesday help topic is going to be about gauging your work. Several weeks ago, I know Robin had asked about gauging your work. And so we're going to talk about that today. I've done some research because I've only gauged my work. Hey, Homespun, good to see you. I've only gauged my work one time because I'm not always a rule follower, I like to make up my own rules. Anyway, normally when I create something or when I make something, if I'm following a YouTube video, I follow what they tell me to do. And usually it turns out okay. Hey, Robin. And so a lot of times it's not clothing or wearable items that I'm making, or if it is a wearable item, it's something like a hat or a scarf or, something like that. So if it's a little bit off, if the hat is a little loose or it's a little tight, I usually, yeah, I'm right there with you, Valerie. I'm usually, I just go with the flow, oh, this one's a little loose, this one's a little tight. Okay, whatever. But the first time that I did use gauge in my work was when I was following a mandala pattern to make a round blanket, a round Afghan, if you will. And it was gorgeous. The mandala was gorgeous. And so there was a written pattern that I was following, but also in addition to that, it was a crochet along with the Crochet Crowd and Mikey. And so he was doing the tutorial week by week, and he broke down the pattern into, I'm going to say, 5 sections. So it was a pattern. He broke it down into 5 sections and he did the tutorial each week for that section. Now, before he started, he did a whole video, not a long one, but it was enough to tell you the importance of gauging for this particular project. The reason that he gave was, now this wasn't a wearable, it was a blanket, but the reason that he said it was important to do a gauge on this one is because it was a round blanket and each row had a different stitch. Each row was, a very unique stitch. In mandala, there's a lot of different really fancy stitches. Some of them are not so fancy because they give you the base, but then they were a lot of fancy stitches. And in order to make sure that your blanket laid flat, you really needed to, according to Mikey, and I believed him, and I still do, you needed to gauge your work so that your work was on the same line, on the same level as the pattern called for. Otherwise, if it was too tight, then it would be possible that your blanket would start bunching up, or if it was too loose, then it would just start ruffling around the edges, and that was an issue because when you have a nice mandala and you have put 52 rows, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you consider that the 52 rows, that by the time you got to the end, that one row might take you an hour and a half to get through, just simply because of how large the blanket got. Um, you know, there was a lot of work and a lot of attention to detail and a lot of stitch work. There were, I believe, 8 different colors to this blanket, or 6 different, I think it was 8 different colors to this blanket. And so there was a lot that you put into that blanket. And so he wanted to ensure success. And so that's why he had us do a gauge swatch. And I did the gauge swatch and I was spot on. And I was very pleased with my results. So that is the only time that I've done a gauge. So with all of that said, let's go back to the beginning and let's start at the beginning. And so I have a list. First of all, number 1, what is a gauge in crochet? And so a gauge is actually a measure of how big your stitches are, and how tall your stitches are and how wide your rows are. So it measures not only the width, but the height of what you're making, because you're not just measuring, the width. And, if you do 20 crochets or 20 chains and then 20 single crochets and you get 4 inches or whatever it's calling for, usually the swatch is 4 inches by 4 inches, because that's a big enough swatch so that you get a feel for how you're crocheting. Because you really can't gauge it on that first row. You really can't. So it gives you a gauge on how it's going to play out in your work. Okay. So it measures the height and width by counting stitches and counting rows, and then also measuring. And usually, like I said, it's 4 inches by 4 inches. So number 2, why gauge is important. And I just gave you an example of why gauge is important with that round mandala blanket, because I never really did a gauge, never did a gauge swatch, wasn't interested. I just really wasn't. But he kind of gave me the feeling that, oh, this is important, because you're right, Mikey. I don't want my blanket to bunch up, and I don't also want to have the waves around the edges. So that's why I did a gauge on that one. But the main reason is because not all crocheters crochet alike. And you and I both know that, when we first started crocheting, for me anyway, my stitches were super tight. I crocheted like I was, having to seal an archive or something. I was crocheting so tight. My single crochets were so tight that there was really no even bend to my work. It was just like, it was really tight. And as I've crocheted, I have relaxed a little bit. What really helped me relax was watching other people crochet. And I was like, whoa, sister, you're pulling that stitch up way high. Aren't you worried that you're going to really, your hook is going to fall out of that stitch? Well, her hook never fell out of that stitch. So I realized that I could relax a little bit. I could loosen up a little bit. I could release the tension in my hands and in my jaw, and I could just let the, yarn flow and just go with it. So with that being said, I started out with really tight stitches, and a lot of newbies do have really tight stitches because of that tension that they feel and the nervousness that they feel. Some newbies may start out a little bit too loose because you haven't figured out the grip yet. You haven't figured out how to keep that tension on your stitches. And so you just, you have really big stitches and that's a tension issue too. So that's one reason why gauging your work can be important, to realize that not everyone crochets like you do. I always thought everybody crocheted like me. You know, I was, you know, I was the example of all crocheters, and yet I wasn't. I was the example of me, and that was it. So, let's see. It says that you can't guarantee to have a proper stitch without checking your gauge. So, if it's something that's important, like a wearable, like a sweater, you know, if you buy, if the directions tell you to buy 8 skeins of a particular yarn to make your size sweater, let's say you're making a medium size sweater, and 8 skeins of yarn will make your medium size sweater, and your gauge is too big, then you're going to use up your yarn before you get to the end. And you're going to have a sweater that's probably a size large or maybe even larger. So that's a problem too. Or if you're still in that stage where you're crocheting really tight, you might have 2 skeins of yarn left over and you're like, well, they told me to buy 8. I wasted my money on 8 skeins of yarn. Look at this. And then you go to put it on and you're like, oh, this one is really a small. It's not a medium. That's why, because I crocheted so tight that I made it smaller than what it should have come out to be. So if you had taken the time to actually do a swatch, then you may have realized that, there was a tension issue. Your item wasn't going to come out the way the directions advised. And, with these written patterns, especially ones that you find, in reputable sites, and by reputable, I don't mean that other places are not reputable. What I mean is that the sites that actually publish, they have people checking their work. So they have people who, they give an early copy of the pattern to. Usually that's all they give. Sometimes the bigger sites will actually give the yarn and whatnot, and then you're actually supposed to send that item back. But if you're using your own yarn and you're testing their pattern, you're testing the pattern for accuracy, but you're also testing it for the proper size. And so, it's really, so they've already done their work. So when you are following a pattern for, say, a medium sweater, you really should be coming out with a medium-sized sweater if your gauge is correct and if you follow the directions properly. You really should be able to trust the pattern. And so that's the whole issue there, is trusting the pattern. So, so we know that you could either run out of yarn or you could have too much yarn left over. And either one is really not where you want to be. I mean, obviously we all don't mind having a little extra yarn, at the end, and more than likely you will, because they're going to make sure that you have enough yarn with the pattern. But, you don't want to have 2 extra skeins. You don't want to purchase more than what you need. Hey, Kathy. Good to see you. And so let's talk about how we gauge our work. So remember last week, I used this little guy as an example, and this is a free pattern that's available on Yarnspirations. And so I just used him as an example last week about how to read patterns. And there was a section on there that talks about gauge. And we kind of skimmed over that last week. I didn't really go into what a gauge was or how you check your gauge, but this time we're going to do that. Now, honestly, with this little squirrel, and I am going to make him, I just haven't had time yet, but I am going to make him because he's going on my Christmas tree next year, or this year, next Christmas. And so anyway, with this little squirrel, honestly, I probably am not going to do a gauge on him because I know that my stitches are going to be consistent. I'm going to use the same hook and the same type of yarn for all of it. And so all the pieces will fit together. So whether my gauge is too tight or too loose, it really won't matter for me, because that just means that my guy will either be a little bit smaller or a little bit bigger, or maybe I'm exactly right and it'll be spot on. But it doesn't matter to me, because this is a little guy who is adorable, and I'm not going to wear him. I don't care if he's a half inch taller than he's supposed to be or a half inch shorter. I really don't care. So I'm not going to gauge him, but we're going to use this as an example. Okay. So on the sheet, it says gauge 20 SC equals 4 inches. And then in parentheses, it says 10 cm. So 10 centimeters. So that's 20 single crochets is going to equal 4 inches. And then it says 23 rows will also equal 4 inches. So, yeah. And then in large letters, it says check your gauge, and it's all caps and it's bold. Check your gauge. And it says use any size hook to obtain the gauge. So what would we do? We would take our hook, and this says to use a G 4mm hook. And it also says to use Red Heart Soft, which is a 4-weight yarn. So you're using your 4-weight yarn and you have your G 4mm hook. And so what you would do is, it says 20 single crochets. So what you're going to do is chain 21 chains. And then you're going to skip the first chain, go into the second chain from your hook, and we never count what's on our hook. The loop that's on our hook, we don't count. Skip that first chain from the hook, go into the second chain from the hook and do a single crochet, and do a single crochet all the way down until you get to the end, and you'll have 20 single crochets. Okay? And then you're going to turn your work, chain 1, and this is where you're going to skip that first single crochet, because you want to have 20 single crochets or the equivalent of it. Okay, so you don't want any extra out there adding to your 4 inches. Okay, your 20 single crochets. So you're going to skip that first single crochet, and that chain 1 is going to represent the single crochet, the first one. Skip that first one, go into the second one, and do 19 single crochets all the way down. And you're going to keep turning your work, chain 1, skip that first single crochet, go into the next one, and you're going to do that for, according to this, 23 rows. Okay, so you don't count the chain, you just count the single crochet rows. So don't count that chain as your first row. Okay, the first row would be your actual first row of single crochets. And so you're going to have 20 single crochets and 23 rows. Then you're going to get your trusty measuring tape or your ruler or something out. And you're going to lay your work flat, and you're going to measure 4 inches by 4 inches. Great. I'm perfect. I've got it. 4 inches by 4 inches. My gauge is great. Okay. Or, mine is only 3.5 inches by 3.5-ish inches. What am I going to do? Well, that means that your work is too tight. So what you can do is go up 1 hook size. And you go up 1 hook size, and that will make your stitches just a little bit larger to make that go up. Now, what if you were 3 inches by 3 inches? You may need to go up 2 hook sizes, possibly even 3, if your work is so tight. Okay, what if you take a deep breath and consciously, Go up one size and then consciously relax with your stitches. That might work too. Okay. Now, what happens if you look at your work and the work is supposed to be 4 inches by 4 inches, and you see it's 4.5 inches by over 4.5 inches high? Then obviously your work is very loose compared to their gauge. So you'll need to go down a hook size. Okay. Now, there is sometimes the problem where you get the length right, but the height is not quite right. So it's possible that your hook size is right, but maybe you're pulling too much. You're making your stitches a little too loose as far as going up. And so, the height might be a little bit longer than what the gauge calls for. And yet the width is correct. So that's where you're going to have to play a little bit with your tension, a little bit with the hook size, and just try to get it as close as you can. Okay. Now, I'm right here with Kathy. Kathy says, after 50 years, I don't gauge, but I hardly ever make wearables like sweaters. Okay. And I'm almost at 50 years, Kathy, not quite. I'm probably about 46 years now, something like that, of crocheting. And I very rarely do a gauge either. And in fact, I told you about my one time of doing a gauge. Okay. And that was my only experience with actually doing a gauge. And I was really pleased with myself. Felt a little proud because my gauge matched what it should have been. So I didn't have any worries. I didn't have any stress over it. But if you need to do a gauge and it doesn't come out right, that's going to give you a little bit of anxiety. And so this is why we wanted to address it this way. So let's see. I think I've gone over all of it, making adjustments, fewer per inch, doing the swatch. Let's see. And more stitches per inch equals too small, and go with a larger hook. Okay, I've gone over all of my notes. So that's good. Does anybody have any questions regarding doing a gauge? Have you tried to do a gauge before? Part of my issue with doing a gauge is that I'm doing 20 single crochets and 23 rows. And I could be putting that effort into making this cute little squirrel. So it's pure laziness on my part, really. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Kathy. Oh, you made lots of hearts for the garlands. Oh, nice. I'm so glad about that. I love making garlands with those little items, don't you? So, gauging your work. Hey, Mary, it's good to see you. Gauging your work can feel a little intimidating. It's not always necessary. Really, it's your work. You get to make the rules. So a lot of times when we're following certain designers on YouTube, they actually don't give you a gauge or tell you a certain number. A lot of times with wearables, they will tell you to measure your body and to make, to measure yourself and to make whatever part of a sweater to make it match your body size. So that way, you are making it a bespoke item for you. It is a custom made item for you. So, we're going to start using those fancy words. Okay. So if anybody asks you, oh, that's a really nice sweater, where did you get it? And you just say, well, it's a bespoke item. It was made especially for me. And you don't have to tell them, hey, I whipped that up in my living room and I measured it on myself. So a lot of times, oh, shamrock's next. I love it. A lot of times, they will do that. And so that's always helpful too, because then you are making it for yourself. But the only problem is if you want to make it for someone else and you don't know, how to make a medium-sized sweater. I mean, let's face it, stores have different versions of mediums out there. So it's always good to know someone's measurement. If there's someone that is close to you, and you can ask them for their measurements, or you can, when they're over, you can just say, hey, can I jot down your measurements, in my little book, just so that if I see the perfect item for you, you may already have something in mind, but that way you can say, if I see the perfect item for you, then I'll have those measurements so I can, try out a tutorial with you in mind or something like that. Mary says she just wings it and goes with it. I know a lot of us do, and that is very brave and daring, and I love it. So I love it too. Yes. So anyway, we're all going to go around wearing bespoke items. We're going to be like, the Queen of England, Princess Diana. I'm still of that era. I loved Princess Diana. She was so beautiful. So anyway, that is basically how you do a gauge. That's basically why you do a gauge. And so here's the freedom to you to do a gauge or not do a gauge. It's really your call. Don't ever feel guilty if you don't do a gauge, but don't be surprised if you're doing a wearable and it comes out a little bit different than what the pattern maker says. So, I'm willing to, if I'm willing to risk it, then I don't have any reason to be, upset or disappointed with anyone except for myself because I didn't do the gauge. So that's the way it is. So if nobody has any questions, then I will let you go. And I do enjoy spending time with you. And I'm glad that you guys are here. And I hope that this has helped you a little bit. I will see you next time. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I saw online on my statistics where 50% of the people that watch my channel aren't even subscribed. And so I'm like, you guys are going to miss a whole lot if you don't subscribe and hit that bell so that you get notifications when a new video or a new live comes on, because we do lives. And today is Tuesday, tomorrow's Wednesday. Wednesday is our Whip Wednesday. And Whip Wednesday is where you grab your whip, your current whip, or one of your whips, if you're like me, and we sit and we crochet. And tomorrow I've got lots of fun things to entertain us while we crochet. So I hope that you can make it. And hugs to you too, Kathy. Thank you. And thank you, Valerie. And Mary, let's see, Mary, Kathy, Robin. I'm sorry if I've lost some of you, but all of those comments and PJ, Homespun, all of those comments have kind of like shroom up for me. So it's hard for me to keep track of you, but I hope that you have a great day. Stay safe, be kind, and get hooking. Bye, everybody.